Hello, everyone, and for joining us for today's webinar, Beyond the Boxes, Not Just Boys and Girls. My name is Danny Shapiro, and I'm on the marketing team here at Hawks Learning. Our speaker today is Dr. Trisha Prunty of Lindenwood University. Dr. Prunty has authored questions, edited content, and worked on chapter projects for our course, Introduction to Psychology. We arranged this webinar so that she can share some of her expertise with you, other psychology instructors from across the country. At Hawks, we understand the value of partnering with faculty in order to create and maintain high-quality course materials. We believe that your expert insight is invaluable, and that is how we were able to connect with Dr. Prunty. Dr. Prunty has been a psychology educator since 2006 after graduating with a degree in neuroscience and behavior from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She teaches courses that range from human sexuality to clinical neuroscience to animal minds. She's passionate about disseminating knowledge that will help reduce stigmatization and increase compassion. If you have questions throughout this webinar, please enter those into the Q&A box located on the panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure to get to them at the end of the talk. And on that note, I would like to hand it over to our presenter.
All right, good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm excited to talk today about something that I'm passionate about, which is gender and the development and moving beyond what I say is beyond the boxes, not just boys and girls. So Danny already introduced me, but I am going to reiterate a few of the things that he said. I did graduate in 2006 from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst with a degree in neuroscience and behavior. So I know that makes it sound like I do a lot of brain scans and all of this different things like that, when in reality, I worked with the last of Harry Harlow's rhesus monkeys. And so if you're a psychology person, I'm sure you know who I'm referring to. So I worked with his graduate student who took over his primate colony, and my dissertation was on a comparison of object permanence in monkeys and kids, because as we all know, children are just monkeys, right, essentially. So the other thing that I've done now is my background is also in experimental psychology. So I run the psychology lab at my current university, and this is my newer primates that I work with, that we do a lot of different studies in the lab, ranging from a wide degree of topics. So my classes are very varied in that I teach human sexuality, neuroscience classes, research classes, cognition, and my research is also relatively diverse. So I study things from social justice, looking at various things like catcalling and internalized misogyny in women, also cognition and learning and memory in the brain. And then the other thing that's really interested me in recent years is looking at empathy and how do we actually develop that. Especially coming from a situation where I teach human sexuality, I've seen students over the years that have certain backgrounds or upbringing that really has painted what life should be like and what it is. And I really see that course, human sexuality, as an ability to build empathy in individuals. So I may not necessarily agree with something, but I can have empathy and compassion to you as a fellow individual walking this path through life. So I'm actually going to circle back to empathy towards the end of this, because that's really the whole purpose for me in doing this today. Okay, so starting with this idea of the boxes, okay, we have this traditional idea of men and women, and those terms are largely defining, right? So if you look at somebody and you say, oh, that's a man, that automatically gives you some assumptions about that individual. You see somebody who's a woman, it's an automatic assumptions about that person. And so those assumptions might be about their roles, you know, gender roles. What are they doing at the home? What are they doing in the world? Their job. What kind of profession are they probably in? The attire that's expected of them. How are they going to actually promote their appearance? What attitudes do they have as a male or a female, a man or a woman? Interests. Okay, now I think a lot of us, especially in psychology, realize that these aspects are not really fixed on someone's anatomical sex, right? So just because you're a guy doesn't mean you have to like sports. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you have to love makeup tutorials. We realize that there is a much wider sense to what it is to be human, and your gender doesn't, or your anatomical sex may not actually influence those things. However, if you go into the general public, for a lot of people in society, these boxes are really well defined. And these are individuals who may hold those different ideas or roles that they feel are relatively permanent, and you can't really deviate too much. And in fact, we have a lot of movies in society that make fun of that. So if you think about Meet the Parents, where you have a male nurse, and it's a running gag throughout the entire movie about how this is not a role for a man, okay? Um, so we all probably in psychology agree that these are not set in stone. But a lot of people will still look at these two boxes, male and female, man and woman, and assume that they understand now somebody's appearance of their genitals, okay? Because if that guy is a guy, then he must have a penis, right? And if that woman is a woman, she must have a vulva. And I'm going to use that term rather than vagina, which is very open in society as far as what people tend to name. Vulva is actually more technically correct. And so we have this idea what we understand what people's genitals look like, which is, for me, it makes gender reveals really weird because it's essentially a party celebrating what the child has in a lot of weird ways. All right. And then another one that people tend to think of is attraction, right? So if there is a man, you automatically assume, or at least society automatically assumes, there's certain attractions that go with being a man, certain attractions that go with being a woman. So again, looking at these as these boxes, they may not be completely dichotomous. There might be a spectrum, a range. And so what I'm really going to look at today is one role, one impact on these aspects, which is biology. Because that understanding of here's what the genitals are going to look like, or this is how you develop into a man or a woman, is based on this idea that we all go through the same exact process in order to develop, okay? And so I'm going to cover that process with the idea that we have these two dichotomies, male and female, man and woman, but maybe there's differences along that or within that where there is a degree of variety. And so we're really going to look at how does the internal genitals and how do the external genitals develop normally, and then I'm going to introduce some deviations to that. Okay. And here, what I'm really going to be talking about and focusing on in this next portion is anatomical sex. Now, I'm sure you guys have all seen, or most of you probably have seen, this gingerbread person, but it's not gingerbread, it's genderbread. And it's looking at these different components that make up gender and sexuality. Okay, so one is identity. And this is the degree to which a person feels or identifies themselves as a man or a woman. So you have a sense of who you are. Okay, and then there's attraction. So who are you attracted to on one side or the other? Or nobody, that's also an option as well. Okay, how you choose to express your gender. So if I feel like a woman, perhaps I enjoy wearing dresses and makeup. Maybe I don't. Maybe I still feel like a woman, I identify as a woman, but I am more tomboyish. I enjoy sports. I could care less about makeup. So that's my ability to express my gender in however form I feel is acceptable to me and true to me. And then anatomical sex. And what you're going to notice here is there's an arrow and there's a plus, and those are our two boxes that we dichotomously put everybody into. And then there's one that combines the two. And this might be what we would think about as intersex. And I have met with many students over the years that they don't understand that that's even a possibility. For them, it's you're a boy or you're a girl. There is no in between. So this idea of intersex and this whole concept is absolutely foreign. So what I really want to do is show you how that middle part of that spectrum can be created through biology. So in order to do that, I have to tell you a little bit about regular differentiation into boys and girls. Okay. We all start off in development with what they call bipotential gonads. That means that the gonads are the exact same, whether you are going to be a boy or a girl. And then depending on signals in the environment, it shifts the development of those gonads into something more boy-like versus something more girl-like. So we all know that if I have an XY combination of chromosomes, that's going to trigger boy development. The other option would be XX for a female. Okay. So in the case of a boy, if a person, we'll start with a person, gets an XY chromosome, the Y chromosome is actually the most important influencer on those bipotential gonads. The Y chromosome has a gene called the SRY gene. And what this SRY gene does is it signals to the bipotential gonads to become testes. Okay, so internally already, these are not descended, they are just still internal to the person. They become testes. And once they do that, they begin to produce and secrete testosterone. That circulating testosterone then helps promote both internal and external genital development. So you get your vas deferens, penis, scrotum, all of those different components, okay, as we would expect with a boy. On the flip side, if we lack that SRY gene, based on the fact that we lack that Y chromosome, the female system waits, and it's waiting for that signal for the SRY gene. It's not there. So once that occurs, it triggers a different level of development where instead of testes, that bipotential gonad becomes ovaries. And then those ovaries will then promote internal and external genital development because they were missing a signal from SRY gene. They are missing testosterone, and that not being there creates this other path of development. Okay. So this is what happens normally for boys and girls. However, it doesn't always work this way. And that is where we begin to build the understanding of the in between those two boxes. Okay. So in one case, we have the SRY gene, triggers testes, triggers testosterone. Now there is a really important thing that has to happen here for this testosterone to cause the development of a boy. And that is that you have to have androgen receptors. So these are a type of receptor that are scattered throughout, they're in the brain, that are essential for picking up or answering the call of testosterone. When I talk to my students, I liken testosterone to calling the system and saying, hey, pick up. And the androgen receptors are the ones picking up the phone. Okay, and once they do, they trigger internal genital development, they trigger external genital development. But what happens if no one answers the phone? So testosterone is there, it's coming from the testes, it's circulating, it's doing what it's supposed to do. However, its promotion is not being answered, it's not being received. And so what happens is you derail both internal and external genital development. So if you pause to think about that for a second, testosterone is circulating, you have these internal testes, everything is on track, and it just got stopped. The system is going to read that as if there was no testosterone, there was no testes, there was no SRY gene, and you end up developing external genital development that looks like a girl. Okay, so this is a chromosomal boy who is born looking like a female. Okay, and so we've gone from this male box and converted it essentially to a female box. Okay, so that creates this situation where we now have this middle ground, okay? And it suggests that hormones are pivotal. We need that testosterone signal to promote this development, okay? So that leads to my next sort of variation in differentiation, and that's for a girl. So again, we have a girl. The system is waiting for that SRY promotion, and it doesn't happen. And so the ovaries are created, and they start to promote the internal and external genital development. But hormones are really key here. And sometimes mom is exposed to things in the environment. Sometimes it's even related to the idea that mom has excessive stress levels. Okay, when stress levels go up, hormones that are very similar to testosterone start to increase. Okay, so those stress hormones can actually start to influence and affect the developing fetus. And so what can actually happen is those stress hormones act like testosterone, and they start to impact the system and can start to masculinize the baby. Okay, so it masculinizes the external genital development, and it can masculinize the brain because it's a hormone, so it circulates throughout. And what you see are cases where babies are born with what they call ambiguous genitalia. That means you cannot just say, oh, it's a girl, congrats, it's a boy, congrats. It ends up being this sort of mix between the two. And typically, in the past, people would surgically correct the people to be girls. And then more so today, people tend to wait to see just how much masculinization actually happened. So these women are women who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and they can be very different from our traditional box of here's what a girl should look like. They may have no interest in getting married, childcare, any of those things. There's a higher degree of bisexuality and homosexuality. It's not definitive by any means, but it is suggestive that hormones can impact this system. It can impact all of these different aspects. And so if we look at that hormonal influence, what else could this really impact? How could this influence so many different things? And how do we know if we've been influenced by hormones? And there is a really neat study that was done a couple of years ago that was looking at your finger lengths. Okay, so this is a really well-known sex difference. If you look at the finger lengths for women and men, they tend to have differences in what they call their 2D and their 4D. So the second digit and the fourth digit. So this hand that I have pictured here is actually a more, I don't know the gender of the person or the sex of the person, but I do know that this person has a low ratio. It is a more man-like hand, such that the second digit is shorter than the fourth digit, even evidenced by the arrows that I drew there. So give you a comparison, this is my hand. So you can see that my fourth digit is shorter than my second digit. This is a typical difference between men and women, that men have a smaller ratio such that their fourth digit is longer than the second, and women have a larger ratio such that the second digit is larger or longer than the fourth. Okay, so whenever I teach this in class, I always have students looking at their hands and, getting all excited about this, or worried, as it were, because then a lot of women are like, why do I have a male-like hand? It is suggestive of hormonal exposure in the time of development. Okay, so you can see this already in young kids that they have this difference. And so let's say you do have a hand that's a little bit more male-like and you are a female. What does that mean? It might mean that you have had a little bit of exposure to androgens in development. Maybe that explains certain differences that you might have. So one example that comes to mind is men tend, and I'm really speaking in generalities here, but men tend to be better at spatial navigation, map reading, driving, not necessarily getting lost, but having an internal compass in their head. Okay, women tend to not be as good at that. Now, there are exceptions, but maybe those exceptions are based on hormonal exposure. And so one of my students a couple of years ago, she worked for the Air Force, or I guess she was an Air Force member, and we were talking about 2D, 4D and spatial awareness and these sorts of things. And she really wanted to do a study where she compared spatial ability and 2D, 4D in women in different job positions in the Air Force. Okay, so what she actually did is she gave 3 different groups of women in the Air Force a cube comparison test. So it is a 3-minute test where you are rotating things in your mind to figure out if they match or if they don't. And then she also measured their 2D, 4D ratios. And she was looking across their different job types. So one group were administrative assistants in the Air Force. The next group were tanker pilots. So these are pilots who do not have great maneuverability. They largely work on autopilot, some maneuverability skills, but nothing to the point where you would expect of a fighter pilot. Okay, so she had these 3 groups: administrative assistants, tanker pilots, and fighter pilots. It should not surprise anybody that looking at the cube comparison test with that spatial manipulation all internal, the fighter pilots outperformed everybody else. The interesting thing was that their ratios of their hands were much more male-like than they were female-like. So their ratios between their 2nd and their 4th digit were much more like men than they were like their comparison women in the Air Force. Okay. So again, it's suggestive that hormones can influence things that we may not even realize that will then lead to some of those differences in our roles and jobs and things like that. You know, with genital appearance, that makes sense with the hormones, but all of these other things that we don't necessarily realize that hormones may play a role in, and how they might be shifting us on that spectrum in all these different ways. So another one that we could look at is this idea of attraction and sexual orientation, and how does this get changed from, you know, heteronormative kinds of situations. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that there is some biology at play here. Okay, so again, we can go back to the hormones. I've been kind of harping on the hormones the whole time. If we look at the hormones and we look again at that finger length difference, there was a study a couple of years ago that looked at women who identify as homosexual. So these are women who are lesbians, they're in lesbian relationships, and they measured their 2D, 4D ratios, and they were more male-like. So they had lower ratios. Their pointer finger tended to be shorter than their ring finger. And so that was suggestive of maybe that hormonal influence early on might have shifted sexuality. And in fact, when they then compared more feminine lesbians to more masculine lesbians, the ones who were masculine were actually lower in their ratio. So again, suggesting that there's possibly some influence here of these hormones. Now, I know when I teach this in class, I have a lot of students that start to look worried, and I always have a caveat that says, just because you have a more male-like hand, that does not mean you're a lesbian, right? We have to remember correlation and causation. One thing doesn't necessarily equate to the other. What it does mean is that, again, in a generality, in a particular study, women who were lesbians tended to have more male-like hands. Not that if you have a more male-like hand, this is obviously a difference in your sexuality. Okay, another component that may influence this is birth order. And I know this one, when I first started teaching about it, seemed really strange to me. Like, why in the world would birth order have any influence on this? It doesn't make any sense. But the biology is actually pretty neat. So I don't know that a lot of people necessarily realize this, but when a woman carries a male child, the Y chromosome actually leaches into mom's blood. Okay, so in the way that we know that is that there is a test called a panorama test that women can have early on in their pregnancy that is a maternal blood draw. So it draws blood from mom, and they can test for genetic abnormalities in the fetus. But the other thing that they can actually determine from that test is if the child is a boy, because it's picking up Y chromosome. Okay, so that's amazing to me that women have Y chromosome basically circulating when they're carrying a male child. So what that actually suggests, it suggests some support for this idea of birth order, because the idea of birth order is that a male child is like an illness that the female body doesn't understand because it's never had a Y chromosome before. And so Y chromosome is circulating, mom starts to build antibodies to that, and maybe it's okay for the first, second, third child, that are boys, but eventually your body gets good at fighting off that disease, okay, the Y chromosome that the body is mistaking for something that's not good. And so maybe by the time you have your third or fourth son, the body is attacking the baby to a degree that they actually are affecting their sexuality, their sexual orientation. So it's interesting to look at that, and I always tell my students that I'm going to find out, because I have 3 boys, and so we will see what's going to happen, and it'll be this anecdotal case. The last one that I find super fascinating is this idea of genetics. And nobody's been able to find a gay gene or something that you can just lock down to one particular piece. But there is a suggestion that there is something genetic. And the piece of information that I have for it is a little different than some of these others. A couple of years ago, there was the creation of an AI program, so artificial intelligence, that boasts that all you have to do is give it a still picture and it can identify if you are homosexual or not. And in fact, if you give it 3 still pictures of yourself, it's up to 91% accurate in identifying people that are either homosexual or heterosexual. So to me, that suggests that there's something structural about the face that differs, that this AI computer program can run its algorithms and determine and figure out. Okay, so again, another piece of interesting evidence suggesting that biology is certainly at play. And because of that, I think it's a little easier to see that we can't really have this box and this box that are absolutely differentiated, and it defines you entirely from everything that you want to do and hope and dream, and your genetics and your anatomical sex, sexual orientation, all of that is going to vary on this spectrum. Now, why is that important? So I said at the beginning that for me, in having students over the years, that if you very strongly believe that there's one box and there's another box and there is no in between, I think it can sometimes be difficult to have understanding for someone that violates those norms. And so you can think about somebody who identifies as transgender, and we know that there's been a lot of controversy about that lately, and dealing with that in the military and bathrooms and things like that. And I can understand from a standpoint of boys are boys, girls are girls, there is no in between. But if you stop and think of the biology and the fact that hormones can influence girls to be more spatially oriented and can do all of these different things, it leaves room for that being a possibility for individuals who are transgender. So you can imagine that girl, the XX that I had going in, and there being a lot of stress hormones. So let's say theoretically that masculinizes the brain. Those hormones can impact the brain. And it shifts the brain from a default woman setting to more of a man-like setting, but the body is a girl. And so you end up having a situation of gender dysphoria where a person feels trapped in the wrong body, probably based on hormonal influence. Now, again, we don't necessarily know what is causing those shifts. It may not be as simplistic as something of only hormones. It might be other things that are happening. But I think just understanding that there are shades in between. It's not just black and white. It's not just boy or girl. It's not just blue or pink, but there's shades in between, can help all of us have a degree of compassion and understanding for people who are different than ourselves. And really that's, for me, I think the biggest thing. I had a student the other day, prior to all of this crazy virus stuff, we were doing a gathering of psychology students and we're playing card games and just hanging out. And he had come from another class where they were talking about transgender issues. And he walks in and he's still kind of in his head about this. And he says, I can't, I'm not down with that transgender thing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what do you mean you're not? He was like, I just don't believe in it. And I was like, well, can we like talk about this in my office? And so we went and talked to my office and I explained to him some of the things that I'm explaining here today about hormones and how things aren't discrete necessarily, that there's a lot of in between. And he just basically said he couldn't believe in it. And I said, well, for me, I can't change your beliefs. I can't force you to think what I think or anything else. But what I can ask you to do is to stop a moment and ask yourself, is your absolute need to come into a room of 40 different strangers and say you don't believe in XYZ, more important than those rights of those 40 people in the room, and to not have to necessarily hear that? And I said, because you don't know who you're talking to, because if you are coming in with this idea that a male face matches male genitalia, that may not be who you're talking to. You don't actually know who's in there. And he paused for a moment and he realized, and this was, I didn't say it, he did. He said, you make me sound really selfish. And since that time, he and I have had multiple conversations where he has talked to me about how he's been more sensitive in his language and more compassionate to people. And even though he still doesn't believe, and he still doesn't support, he doesn't feel the need to sort of put that out into the world where everybody else can pick up on that and either wear it for themselves or not. So I think for me, the importance of understanding this, again, even if you say, no, this doesn't really apply to me, it doesn't really fit my worldview, it's the idea that it gives us grounds for respecting diversity and respecting other people and stopping and having empathy for someone outside of your own shoes, outside of your own worldview, outside of everything that you've ever experienced. And so for me, I think that's one of the reasons I love to teach about this, because it does kind of throw some beliefs under the bus. But there still is a degree of controversy related to it, and really good conversations with students. It's probably one of my favorite things, especially the hands, because everybody's always looking and trying to figure out what in the world is going on. Okay. I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We do already have some questions coming in.
Okay.
So the first question we had was, are we going to be sharing the recording? And yes, we will be sharing the recording and emailing that to everyone who attended. So if you want to use this for reference later or pass it on, we would love that. So yeah, getting a number of questions, and let's just kick them off here in the order that we received them.
Okay.
When you are talking about the 2D, 4D ratio, is that a dichotomous distinction between males or females? And the question asker goes on to say, what I mean is when 2D is even longer than 4D, is that female more feminine?
Not necessarily. So the science is still trying to investigate and sort of delineate, like, if it's a tremendously big ratio versus a tremendously lower ratio, what does that mean in behavior? And of course, it's really hard to identify that specifically, because as people, we are more of a generality than we are anything else. So even multiple times through this, I was making very dichotomous statements. I was like, oh, wait, hold on. I can't, people are just so diverse, you can't really say. So in general, most women are X or whatever, right? So there's still a lot of investigation into this difference. It also turns out that it's more related to your dominant hand than your non-dominant. So that's a really interesting distinction, because I don't know if any of you noticed that, but some of them are different. But it seems to be related to dominant versus non. And then that leads to this idea of ambidextrous. And so there's still a lot of research that's being done on finger lengths and what does it actually mean, as far as, can we really use it as a litmus for, say, how much hormonal exposure you had? And it's hard to say, because it is, again, something we can't necessarily experimentally control. It is really correlational. So we can't go back and say, okay, we're going to flood you with a bunch of androgens and see what happens to your finger lengths. And then we can see, does it actually match up with how much we gave you?
So we had one question, sort of, I think you just addressed it, but asking about if the hand matters, right or left.
Yes, it does seem to be dominant. And there's a lot of confusion about your non-dominant as far as why might it differ.
And we had 2 questions here about the AI program that recognizes faces and sexual orientation. One asking if you could share that reference, and another asking if there's a website that talks more about it. Both were very interested.
Yes, I do. I don't have that right with me. But I can. I don't know if there's a way to include that. I know I have. We've written a paper on it. I just don't remember the source right off the top.
Sure, we can include it in our email out to everyone who
Perfect.
today. So
Yeah.
we'll make sure to include that in our follow-up.
Absolutely. Yeah, we actually did a study on that, based on, because people have this general idea that we have gaydar, or that, people can look at someone and just identify. And largely that's from mannerisms and dress. But the cool thing about the AI program, it was just a still photo. And in fact, if you gave it more photos, it was more accurate. And so we wanted to see if humans were the same. And it turns out that we showed in our study that gaydar was not really established. But what was established was that people who were homosexual were more likely to be able to pick out the non-homosexual male, which we tend to think is probably something survival related. You need to know the person you shouldn't approach in that case, with all of the situations we've had in the past of homophobia and things like that. So it's probably something more of a survival mechanism rather than like, oh, hey, I think that guy's gay or that woman is gay.
One more question before we have some questions on different subjects, but one more on the 2D, 4D.
Okay.
Kimberly asks if you can see that difference in infants.
So everything that I've read says it shows up pretty early on. That difference is there before age 2. So I don't know that people have necessarily studied. I think it's a lack of study in those younger age groups, but that they have documented by the time they're 2. It makes sense to me that it would be there at birth, in the idea that this is when that hormonal exposure would occur, would be pre-birth.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. Can you talk a little bit about brain structures of male and female-bodied people? Are there differences? How significant? How much overlap? Do differences even mean anything?
Oh, wow, that's a whole class in and of itself. So there are differences, but they're not necessarily well understood. I think that's part of it. So there are differences in certain brain areas. So one of the ones that come to mind is the INAH3. So INAH. I know I said that really fast, but it is a part of the hypothalamus. And there is a sex difference in that it is larger in men than it is in women. Now, what that area of the brain does, a lot of scientists are disagreeing, or not really disagreeing, but trying to figure out exactly what it does. But the interesting part about it is it's actually different between heterosexual men and homosexual men, such that that brain area is more similar in size in homosexual men to heterosexual women. So suggesting that there's been some change there. Now, we can't tell if that was at birth. So maybe that brain area was different at birth, which then indicated that this male would be homosexual. or if it's a product of living life as a gay person, right? So, I mean, we know as psychology people that the brain changes based on experiences. You know, if you become a taxi driver, you get better at knowing where everything is, and you actually expand your spatial mapping in the brain. So there are differences. And that one I think is really intriguing. Another one is there's differences that really support some of the known male-female differences that we have, like women are more likely to hear sounds or notice things visually, like a stain on a shirt or things like that. And those are all brain-derived differences. So I do think they are important in that they can explain some of our discrepancies across sex, in that, you know, women complain, well, why can't you hear the faucet dripping? Well, it's the guys really just can't. It's a brain difference really more than anything else.
Okay. Before we move on to another question, we just had a comment just wanting to thank you very much for the clarity of the presentation. So I thought I would pass that on.
Thank you.
Jeanette asks, when you talk about the prenatal exposure to testosterone triggering male development, both males and females have androgens and estrogen. So during the prenatal development, to males start to get exposed to estrogens and females exposed to androgens.
Okay, I think I lost the thread there somewhere. I was following and then.
Okay, let me try again. Both males and females have androgens and estrogen. Mm-hmm. So when during prenatal development to males starts, do they get exposed to estrogens and females get exposed to androgens?
Okay, I think I understand it. So that's adding a layer that I kept out purposefully because it does get confusing when you start thinking about there is cross, I was going to say contamination, but that's not the right word. So there is cross experience of these different hormones, right? So women do have some testosterone. And in fact, testosterone gets broken down into estradiol, which is estrogen. So testosterone actually leads to the formation of estrogen. And so that is, and another called DHT, dihydrous testosterone. And so both of those, the dihydrous testosterone and estradiol, have impacts on the male development. So they do help with the internal and external development. You know, DHT has particular roles that it does in development. So for boys, that starts pretty soon after that exposure to the testosterone that begins, because it starts to be broken down into those two substances pretty quickly. For girls, they really don't have hormonal exposure until closer to puberty. So this was actually really important in 2008, where they started to realize, well, society started to realize that we as a society were putting fake estrogens into lotions for babies. And so what we were creating is we were creating a situation where we would lather up a baby in shampoos and lotions that had synthetic estrogens. And so we were exposing kids to estrogens. For boys, it was more so than they normally would have. And then girls, they wouldn't even have that until they were much older. And so we were seeing endocrine disruption and other bad effects of that, because typically girls are not hormonal until much later.
Another question here. Can you speak a little on the social aspects that are more culturally transmitted than biologically transmitted? The questioner says your example of the male nurse was something they were interested in.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think part of it comes from, again, this sort of societal belief that there's only two boxes. And I will say that I mean, and I have been an American my entire life, but I do feel in working with other students that maybe that American dichotomy is a little stronger than it is for other cultures. So for example, there are more widely accepted intersex individuals in other countries. India comes to mind. There's a Thai category of like this third gender, which in a lot of other cultures is a completely understood and well known third gender, whereas I feel like this has been a much more recent development for the United States for us to more vocally talk about the fact that there isn't necessarily these two discretes, but instead there is this intermix. Because if you remember when I said earlier about those girls that are born with CAH, and they are an anatomical mix. And of course, that's going to depend on how much exposure, right? So somebody might be much more masculinized than another. But historically, doctors just said, hey, we'll just fix it, and we'll fix it to be a girl. And that's what was done for years, until more recently, where people stopped and said, well, wait a minute. Those hormones are not only affecting the genitals, they're affecting the brain. So perhaps we should wait. But that doesn't really fit that discreteness. So I think, again, it's been something more of a slower shift for us than it has been some other cultures.
A question just came in on, is hermaphrodite a biological term?
Okay, it is, and I love that somebody asked that. That's amazing, because I love to kind of go on this tangent too in class, because we hear that term hermaphrodite. So, and I'm imagining it's because you're hearing me talk about the CAH situation, and this is sort of this mix. So I didn't go into all of this here, but essentially we have bipotential gonads, but we also have the whole system is bipotential, right? So you have one beginning structure, and then depending on the signals that it receives, it either goes female or it goes male. And so you tend to see any sort of mix tends to be like with androgen insensitivity syndrome, where, you know, internal testes, but the outside form like a girl. You don't tend to see full development of male, full development of female. And that's because that tissue can go only one way or the other. It's not really this idea of I can develop both fully. Now, that is not to say that there hasn't been cases where that has happened, but it only happens in a situation of chimera. Okay, so chimera, for anybody who doesn't know, this is the idea that you have twins in utero and one dies early, and the tissue gets incorporated into the other twin. So essentially that twin has incorporated their sibling. And most people don't know that. They're born a singleton and they grow up and everything's fine. But in some cases, the genital tissue, that bipotential tissue, gets absorbed, and then you can have differentiation. But it's really interesting because there was a woman a couple of years ago. She circumstances had changed. Her husband had died. She was trying to get some government assistance, and as a formality, they needed to make sure that her children were her children before they provided her this assistance. And she said, no big deal. So they went and had the testing done. And it turns out that her kids were not her kids. The tests all failed. And she was like, that's not possible. They're absolutely mine. Here's pictures of, you know, at the hospital and whatever else. And she was pregnant. And they said, well, it's got to be something weird with the test. So we will test you, you know, we'll come to the hospital, we'll test you right after you have the baby, and we'll see what's happening. And sure enough, they show up, they test her, they test the baby. The baby is not hers. The baby she just delivered does not match her genetically. And it turns out that she had taken over and grown essentially her sister's uterus, and the baby matched the uterus, but not the mom. So, I mean, that's just, it's wild, right? And you wouldn't think that that's the case, but that's exactly what happened. And so she had her sister's uterus.
Others are finding that a very interesting story as well. Okay, I think we've worked our way through a lot of questions, but we have one or two more I want to try to get to before we sign off for today.
Sure.
Question asks, you mentioned XY males without the ability to receive androgens. Is there an equivalent with XX individuals not being able to process estrogens?
So you wouldn't see those situations until much later, because again, they don't have, so the way it tends to function is the female system is waiting for that testosterone or SRY gene to basically trigger that whole cascade. And if that's absent, just continues down that path. So if you do see lack of estrogen signaling or things like that, that would be something you would see later on, not in this development specifically at that point in time. But we do have, you know, different chromosomal issues like Turner syndrome, Fragile X. So there are other complications, but it doesn't usually shift the anatomical sex or the sexuality specifically.
A final question. I feel like this is a good way to end it. Any
Okay.
recommendations on these topics?
Oh, say it one more time.
Do you have book recommendations on these topics?
Oh, Middle Sex, I think, is a really good one. So that came out a couple of years ago. And it's about somebody who has an intersex experience and what that's like. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to look at all of these different components. Research studies, especially like the AI program or Middle Sex is really what's coming to mind. And one of my favorite books, and it's kind of a ridiculous book, but it's by John Irving. He's an American author, and he wrote Son of the Circus. And it's a wild ride that's got like some stereotypes and other things. It's an older book, but it features a character who is essentially intersex. And I would say probably characterized as identifying as transgender, but it's from a point of view that we didn't necessarily understand what that was at the time. But it really kind of gives this feel of India and what that experience was like for this particular individual in a very fictitious, sometimes overtly crazy, humorous writing. So.
Okay, well, Prunty, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for the presentation.
Absolutely.
Thank you to our audience for a great question and answer session. Really appreciate you being involved. Like I said, we'll be emailing a link out to everyone. If you have questions, you can reach us at marketing@hawkslearning.com. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and stay safe.